Well, I'll begin by saying what my basic theory is about Mark 16:9-20. I propose that Mark was interrupted as he wrote Mark 16:8, and his colleagues in Rome, recognizing the account was unfinished, added verses 9-20, which had been an earlier composition by Mark, possibly intended to be read at Easter. Only after this was done did copies begin to be made and distributed for church use. Now, by the usual definition of originalness, that makes Mark 16:9-20 part of the original text, even though it's not from the primary author. We can look at various books in the Bible, like in Deuteronomy, it talks about Moses' death. In Proverbs, it talks about, well, there are two whole chapters that aren't by the main authors. And in Jeremiah, you have a whole chapter there at the end. Well, before that, it says the words of Jeremiah end here. But then you have in what's been handed down another chapter. How do I explain the loss of Mark 16:9-20 in Egypt? I contend that early scribes in Egypt deleted 12 verses 9-20 due to a meticulous desire to only include the main work that they regarded as having Peter's authority. In the early church of the first and second century, the Gospel of Mark was considered the memoirs of Peter. You can see it referenced this way by Justin, for instance. Now, various commentators have spread a lot of information about Mark 16:9-20. The late Norman Geisler said that verses 9-20 are lacking in many of the oldest and most reliable Greek manuscripts. Larry O. Richards has said that in many ancient Greek manuscripts, the gospel ends at 16:8. Wilfred J. Harrington said that Mark 16:9-20 is omitted in very many Greek manuscripts of the gospel. Donald Joel said that according to the almost unanimous testimony of the oldest Greek manuscripts, Mark ends at 16:8. David Ewood, another commentator, wrote all major manuscripts in this gospel at 16:8. And Eugene Peterson in The Message, although this has been updated since the time the message was first out, but for years this was circulated, the claim that Mark 16:9-20 is contained only in later manuscripts. So be aware that there is a lot of misinformation floating around about Mark 16:9-20, even from sources that are usually considered reliable. Here we see a detail from Codex Sinaiticus. This is the ending of John in ultraviolet light. And you won't see this page at the Codex Sinaiticus website. This is from T.C. Skeet, one of the better researchers of Codex Sinaiticus. And by the way, although I'm saying Sinaiticus, it really should be pronounced Sinaiticus, but it's a habit. But what we see here is that scribes were capable of editing endings for the sake of critical reasons. In other words, because of a belief that it wasn't from the main author. If a copyist could see that and think that it shouldn't be perpetuated in the copying tradition. And this is one example from the book of John in Codex Sinaiticus. You can see where the arabesque, the lines were put in there at John 21:24, and also the closing title. And then, though, it was erased and the final verse was added, and then the closing title was added again. Here we see Codex Vaticanus. Here on the left, you can see the manuscript. And now this manuscript is online. You can easily find it at the Codex Vaticanus website. But some folks have said that Mark 16:9-20 is much too big to include on this page. And by the way, this is the only blank space in the whole manuscript that's deliberately included. Dan Wallace, in the Perspectives book about Mark 16:19-20, Dan Wallace said that it was anything but clear why there are 3 other blank spaces in the Old Testament portion. He's wrong. I say it is perfectly clear. They exist due to the discernible factors involving how the manuscript was made. Before the book of Psalms, the book is formatted in 3 columns per page, but in books of poetry, it's 2 columns per page. And so you have to have a change in the ruling as the book is made. Also, when the scribes change from one scribe writing to another scribe's work being made, it's not as if the scribes were just waiting around for the fellow scribe to do his work and then they begin. They work simultaneously, and then the 2 parts come together. And so there's a blank space where one scribe's work simply ended and the next scribe's work began. And this is not difficult to discern if you simply look at the manuscript. And also at the very end of the Old Testament portion, which ends with Daniel and Bel and the dragon, that part ends because, well, the next part is the New Testament. And of course, the New Testament will begin with a fresh folio. And so there really is no mystery as to those blank spaces in the Old Testament. Now, this blank space that we are looking at here is deliberately left. Usually the scribe would begin a book in the next column right after the column in which he finished a book. But here we see Mark ends at chapter 16, verse 8, and the copyist leaves the next column entirely blank. Now, they would also leave blank the space below the end, but that was normal. But you can see here how I've reconstructed the text of Mark 16:9-20 in the blank space. Now, the lettering is slightly compressed, and these letters were not made by me, but basically I went over the Codex Vaticanus on this page and cut and pasted the text of Mark 16:9-20 letter by letter using the scribe's own lettering. So here you can see that with compression, this text of Mark 16:9-20 and a closing title fits in the blank space. Now in Codex Sinaiticus, made around 225, it has what's called a cancel sheet at the end of Mark and the beginning of Luke. Even though the Nestle Island apparatus doesn't put it out, it's there. The lettering in Luke on the cancel sheet is very, very compressed. So copyists knew how to compress the letters. We see it being done by the copyists who made these pages. And I suspect that is where the copyist made a bad mistake in Luke chapter 1, causing his supervisor to replace his work with these 4 pages. Any questions so far? Okay.
Oh, no, go ahead. I'll ask you at the end. We'll do questions at the end.
Okay, I will keep going. The Diothotes probably wrote the text in Luke chapter 1 first, because that's where his challenge was. If he didn't get the chapter in Luke right, so at the end matched up with the next line of the next page, then he would be working for nothing. So he wrote the text in Luke first before going on to write Mark 14:54-68. And then he started in Mark at his normal rate of letters per column, about 635 letters. But in column 4, for some reason, he resumed compressing his lettering. He also made an omission in chapter 16, verse 1. And when he moved on to the next page, he realized that, wait, I don't have enough letters. He didn't have enough letters to finish the text where he thought it would conclude. If he wrote the text in column 9 at his normal rate of letters per column, he would leave the next column blank. As you can see, if you look at the number of letters in column 9, it's only 552 letters. So why is it so few? Because the scribe drastically stretched out his lettering. He even wrote the name of Jesus in full in verse 6. Normally, it was contracted as a sacred name. And in this way, by really stretching it out and using all the opportunities he had, almost all of them, and that way he had some letters left over to put in column 10. And then he added a very decorative closing line before the closing title. And as John Gwen observed back in the 1800s, it looks like the Diathotes, the corrector, was aware of a textual issue here, and he decided to weigh in on it, deciding to not include verses 9 to 20, and to make sure that it wouldn't be easy for anybody else to do so. This is the last 2 pages of manuscript 304, a commentary manuscript from Middle Ages with text from Matthew and Mark, and as also the commentary. Besides Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, it's the only other Greek manuscript in which the text of Mark stops at 16:8. But it has some features that make me think that it was copied from a damaged exemplar. First, a lot of the commentary material is very similar to the commentary of Theophylact. In chapter 15, they're not in exactly the same order, but the content is almost the same commentary. And Theophylact goes on to comment about verses 9 through 20. Second, 304's Gospels text is at least 90% Byzantine, and one would expect to see Mark 16:9 through 20 in a Byzantine manuscript made in the Middle Ages. And third, there's no customary amen like what we see in 304 at the end of Matthew. And there's no closing subscription like thus ends the interpretation of the Holy Gospel of St. Mark. Instead, there's this little poem, as travelers rejoice on their homeland to look, thus also the scribe at the end of a book. So like manuscripts 2386 and 1420, this might be a case where the end of a manuscript has been damaged, except in this case, it happened to the exemplar instead of to 304 itself. Now, we all know the saying, manuscripts must be weighed rather than counted. But just to get an accurate idea of the lie of the land, let's see what Greek manuscripts support the inclusion of Mark 16:19 through 20. It's pretty much everything except Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, and manuscript 304. This list of magistrals and minuscules is not the entire list. And this is not the entire list either. And this is not the entire list either. Here we reach the end as far as the last time I looked into how many manuscripts we have of Mark that include verses 9 to 20 of chapter 16. The current total is probably slightly higher than this. Now, most of these 1,643 manuscripts are medieval copies of the Gospels. But they include Codex Alexandrinus from the 400s. They also include Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus. Now, Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus, Codex C, is a palimpsest, which means that it's reused parchment. But on this page, after you digitally scrape off the upper writing containing writing from one of Ephraim's sermons, you can see the lower writing consists of Mark 16:14 through 20. These copies also include Codex D, Codex Bezae, which D.C. Parker assigns to the early 400s. I think that's too early, but that's the date that's been popularized. Well, anyway, Codex Bezae has a Western text, and not many manuscripts have a text that's as Western as this. Representatives of multiple text types, whether it's Western, Alexandrian, Byzantine, or Caesarean, have their own distinctive readings in Mark 16:9-20, which indicates that the passage did not drift from Byzantine copies into other forms of text. Here is Codex E, a Byzantine copy of the Gospels from the 700s. And at the top of the page, you can see the title of the lection consisting of Mark 16:9-20. You can also see the incipit, the phrase to be read when the passage was read aloud in church. Throughout the Byzantine world, Mark 16:9-20 was the third of the 11 Hierotheon lections, and it was also read on Ascension Day. Here are the last 3 pages of Mark in Codex W, a block mixed copy of the Gospels, and it is the only manuscript extant that has the Philologion. Contrary to what is stated in the NET, the Philologion is not another ending. It is simply an interpolation that appears between verses 14 and verse 15. Now, Jerome, the translator of the Vulgate, mentions the Philologion in one of his letters, in one of his compositions, and we'll revisit this later. But Metzger commented on the Philologion and said it probably is the work of a 2nd or 3rd century scribe who wished to soften, I think we have an extra there, who wished to soften the severe condemnation of the 11 in 1614. So that's pretty early. There's also a group of manuscripts known as Family One, a particular cluster that shows a form of the Caesarean text. About 15 of its members feature a note about Mark 16:9-20. Now, this is not something that occurred to 15 different copies, as if they randomly chose the same words to express this note. This note has descended from an earlier ancestor, and the stronger representatives of the group, manuscripts 1, 205, 2886, 209, and 1582, the note says, in subcopies, the evangelist's work comes to a conclusion here, that is, at verse 8, and so do the Eusebian canons. But in many, this, that is, verses 9-20, also appears. In the later members of Family One that have the note, including manuscripts 15, 22, 1110, 1192, and 1210, the Eusebian canons are not mentioned, and that is probably because by that time, the typical form of the Eusebian canons had been expanded so as to include verses 9-20. In 3 manuscripts, number 20, 215, and 300, the note says, from here to the end forms no part of the text in some of the copies, but in the ancient ones, it all appears intact. Metzger does not describe this evidence accurately in his textual commentary. Now, in one of those manuscripts that I mentioned, 1582, has an interesting note as well by Mark 16:19. The note says, Irenaeus, who was near the time of the apostles, in his work against heresies in book 3, cites this from Mark. Now, what Irenaeus says in that part of against heresies, which we only have in Latin, But he says also towards the end of his gospel, or towards the conclusion of his gospel, Mark says, "So then, after the Lord Jesus had spoken to them, he was received up into heaven and sits at the right hand of God." That's Irenaeus writing before any of our copies of Mark, whether complete or fragmentary. Mark 16:19 was in Irenaeus' copy. Now, some misinformation has been distributed by Metzger. In 1964, Metzger was able to write that Clement of Alexandrian origin and Eusebius show no knowledge of these verses. Now, this was fixed in later editions, but for a while, this did quite a bit of damage. You'll still see that quote and that same wording being used by some writers. Well, so Bruce Metzger wrote, Clement of Alexandria in origin show no knowledge of these verses, but in Philokalia, part 5, a work by Origen that has been edited by later writers, but there is a passage there in part 5 that looks a lot like it is a reference to Mark 16:19-20. Rather specifically, Mark 16:17-20. And also, you can say this about Origen and a lot of other 12-verse segments of Mark. As far as Clement goes, well, we should ask when we see that claim, how much of Mark did Clement usually quote? I mean, is it something we should expect, or is it not surprising at all that he doesn't quote Mark 16:19-20? When you can look at Clement's quotations from Mark and his uses of Mark, Carl Kosart was a researcher who not too long ago looked into Clement's writings, and if you look at the 626 verses of Mark outside of chapter 10, Clement used 2 verses in Greek, Mark 8:38 and 9:29. And in a few compositions not preserved in Greek, he appears to use a few verses from chapters 13 and 14. The total, if we combine them all, is that except for chapter 10, which he used a lot in Who is the Rich Man Who Shall Be Saved, Clement used no more than 8 verses. That's 1.3% of Mark, chapters 1 through 9, and chapters 11 through 16. So really, the evidence from Clement is no evidence at all. That means really pretty much nothing. Also, speaking of evidence that we need to take a close look at, we often see claims about the non-Markan vocabulary in verses 9-20. Well, before we look into the shorter ending now and some evidence from church fathers, we should really take a close look at that and see how weighty is that. Because when that's all you see, you can easily get an impression. That's not an accident. But Metzger, almost everyone since Metzger has said that verses 9-20 contain 18 non-Markan terms. But when we look at other 12-verse segments of Mark, we see that there are quite a few other 12-verse segments of Mark that have more non-Markan words. The difference between non-Markan and once used words is a matter of how much spin a commentator puts on the evidence. In the contest for 12-verse segments of Mark with the most non-Markan words, Mark 16:9-20 comes in 8th place. Now let's look into the shorter ending of Mark. This is the only other ending that follows Mark 16:8, despite some references by some commentators and a footnote in the New Living Translation to various endings. Here is the earliest witness to the shorter ending. This is 2 pages from Old Latin K, RVL3. or it is known as Codex Babiensis to its friends, from the early 400s. Now, there are some variations within the short ending, even with just 8 catalog manuscripts that attest to it. Now, you might have expected me to say 6, but Mina Monier announced the discovery of 2 more about a couple of weeks ago. The 2 Katina manuscripts, 2937 and 1422. All of these copies continue to present verse 9, although incidental damage prevents some of them from showing all 12 verses up to verse 20. The shorter ending goes like this: but they reported to Peter and those with him all that they had been told. And after this, Jesus sent out through them from east to west the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. Amen. Now, if you look at Codex Babiensis, you'll see some very notable features as well as the shorter ending. There's an interpolation between verses 3 and 4, in which, well, you can read Master's commentary about that. Also, part of verse 8 is missing. And also, the copyist made a couple of mistakes as he wrote the short ending. For instance, he wrote, from the east to the east. Now, overall, if you were to take a closer look throughout the Gospel of Mark, you would almost certainly conclude this is the worst copy of Mark that we have in any language. Now, a much better copy of Mark is Codex L, or 019, from the 700s. Codex L also contains the shorter ending before it also presents verses 9 to 20. There are some significant notes in Codex L before the shorter ending and before verse 9. Before the shorter ending, it says, in some, that is, in some copies, there's also this. And before verse 9, it says, there's also this, appearing after Evamdorgar, that is, the last words of verse 8. Now, this reflects a situation where the notes author knew of some copies with a shorter ending after verse 8, and some copies with the usual 12 verses after verse 8. But is there more that we can say about where this situation existed? Oh, yes, there is. In Greek Civic Lectionary 1602, we see very similarly the shorter ending preceded by a similar note. After the shorter ending, we see another note with the same words that begin the note that appears in Codex L, except instead of just saying that verse 9 appears after verse 8, in this Egyptian lectionary, the text from the second part of verse 8 is written again, followed by verses 9 to 20. Codex L, Codex Psi, 004, and 083 share the same note, and fragment 099 shares the same format that we see in this lectionary, with the short ending and with the second part of verse 8 written again from the words Eikengar Altas. All 5 of these witnesses are echoing the same situation, a situation that appeared in one specific locale, namely Egypt. The historical picture indicated by this evidence and by other Sahidic evidence is that in Egypt, the Gospel of Mark initially circulated without verses 9 to 20, like in Sahidic manuscript Palau Ribes 182 at Barcelona, and the Synodic Syriac manuscript. But someone in Egypt could not stand such a sudden stop in the narrative, and so he wrote the shorter ending to wrap things up. And then manuscripts showed up with verses 9 to 20 in Egypt, and so both endings were included. Now let's look into Excuse me. Now let's look into some evidence from church fathers, beginning with writings that were written before any of these manuscripts. Once again, we face terrible misinformation from some commentators about this subject. For instance, H. Walker Evans and Leigh Richards are responsible for this statement. None of the early church fathers indicate a witness of these verses for the first few centuries of Christianity. That claim was actually published in a book in very recently. But according to the late Robert Stein, a writing called Epistula Apostolorum, which you can track it down online, shows its author's awareness of verses 9 through 20. Now, Epistula Apostolorum was not known to Westcott and Hort back in the 1800s. Justin Martyr uses verbiage that is very much like wording found in Mark 16:20. In 1881, Hort questioned the significance of this on the grounds that Justin did not specify that he was referring to Jerusalem. But after Siaska published the Arabic Diatessaron in 1888, both Frederick Chase and J. Vendel Harris noted that the grounds for Hort's objection had been removed. Haitian included Mark 16:9-20 in the Diatessaron in the 170s, and as we already saw, Irenaeus quoted from Mark 16:19 around the year 180. So several other early church fathers listed here used material from Mark 16:9-20. Ephrates in 337 is notable as an early Syriac source. Hierocles is interesting because he was an enemy of the church, mentored by Porphyry. He used Mark's reference to poison drinking as a challenge to believers. The Old Latin chapter summaries also are significant, especially the form that is assigned to the time of Cyprian or shortly thereafter. And then in the early 300s, we come to Eusebius. Eusebius made some comments about Mark 16:9-20 when answering questions posed by a person named Marinus, whose questions embedded in Eusebius's reply show that Marinus's text of Mark 16 included verses 9-20. Eusebius was quite aware of the existence of verses 9-20, and Eusebius is almost always misquoted or quoted selectively, as if all that he and Jerome said is that verses 9-20 were absent from almost all Greek copies of the Gospel of Mark known to them. It is important to read Eusebius's comments carefully and thoroughly. Fortunately, that can be easily done nowadays by reading Roger Pierce's book, Eusebius of Caesarea, Gospel Problems and Solutions, which is online. It has the Greek text of Eusebius's answers to Marinus and an English translation. And we can see that Metzger left out quite a few things when he was referring to Eusebius. Eusebius said that there are two ways one might approach the harmonization problem posed by Marinus. One option is to simply reject Mark 16 verses 9-20 on the grounds that they're not in all copies, or because they're not in accurate copies, or because they're found in hardly any copies. Now keep in mind that Eusebius is writing in the early 300s. The Diocletian persecution was in his memory. He did not have the means to take a survey of Christian libraries all across the empire one by one. He could describe copies that he knew about, as Caesarea always told about. Now, as Eusebius said all this, he framed it as something that could be said by someone. But there's another option, and this is what he appears to advocate to Marinus. Separate rising early from the rest of the verse, and it easily harmonizes with Matthew 28. And he went into some detail about how to do this. Eusebius even goes into detail about how verse 9 should be read aloud, the sort of thing a lector would do. It appears that this is the option that he expected Marinus to take. Eusebius also used Mark 16:9 two other times in Ad Marinum. Once he reported that it is said in some copies of Mark that Jesus had cast seven demons out of Mary Magdalene. And once he simply states that Mark says that Jesus cast seven demons out of Mary Magdalene without any qualification. Now let's consider what Jerome says. In his letter number 120 to Hedibia, Bruce Metzger and an army of commentators who are just echoing Metzger, they also named Jerome as someone who says that Mark 16:9-20 is seldom found in Greek copies of Mark. But there's more to what Jerome says. And we see it here. He's just summarizing what Eusebius had written, adding the word Greek, because Jerome wrote in Latin in nearly 400s, while borrowing Greek material that Eusebius wrote in the 300s. And so he doesn't want to present Eusebius as saying that the Latin copies don't have, because they both knew better. Jerome's own Vulgate included it. Before Jerome made this Latin abridgment of Eusebius' material, he had included Mark 16:9-20 in the Vulgate in 383. In the preface to the Vulgate Gospels, Jerome had specifically said that he used ancient Greek manuscripts as the basis for his translation work. In a later composition of his, Against the Pelagians, when he described the Philologion following Mark 16:14, he said that the Philologion was especially in Greek codices. And it should not be overlooked that in a letter written to Augustine, Epistle 75, Jerome openly confessed that he borrowed material from other writers. He wrote, "I candidly confess that I read the writings of the fathers, and complying with universal usage, I put down in my commentaries a variety of explanations that each may adopt from the number given the one which pleases him." So it is not surprising to see Jerome doing just what he said he did when it comes to him recycling Eusebius's material. As D.C. Parker observed, actually, I think D.C. Parker's comment here is a little bit of an exaggeration. Jerome did add some independent comments, but on this point, Jerome's work is simply a translation with some slight changes of what Eusebius had written. Let's continue. Here we see some more church fathers who used material from Mark 16:9-20 during the days of the Roman Empire. Fortunatianus, his commentary was just recently discovered, and we can see him say that Mark deserves the icon of the eagle. Now, this is referring to the traditional symbols that are used for each gospel writer. Matthew is usually the man, and Mark is usually the lion, and Luke is usually the ox, and John is the eagle. But Fortunatianus says that Mark deserves the eagle because he speaks of Jesus' ascension, which, of course, it only comes up in chapter 16, verse 19. Now, Ephraim Cyrus also used Mark 16, 19, 20 around the year 363. Apostolic Constitutions around the year 381 uses a large chunk from Mark 16, 16 through 18. And Ambrose of Milan used the comments of Mark 16, 19, 20 over and over. Now, you won't find the name Palladius in any textual apparatus that I have seen, but his very clear quotation of Mark 16, 19 has been known since 1899. Now, the writings listed here represent a variety of locales. Patrick wrote in Ireland. Ambrose wrote in Italy. Augustine wrote in North Africa. Macarius Magnes is not called Magnes because he was great, but because he was in the city of Magnesia in Asia Minor. Epiphanius wrote on Cyprus. Marcus Eremita was in the land of Israel. Esnik was writing in Armenia in the 400s, and Ephraim wrote in Syria. All of these writings should be in your textual apparatus. There are other witnesses who used material from Mark 16, 19, 20 before the 700s. In other words, before 90% of the manuscripts. Victor of Antioch, Victor's copy of the Palestinian exemplar Mark, the writer Severus, Leontius of Jerusalem, various Latin writers. And there's also one that's interesting here called the Enthronement of the Archangel Michael. That's from about the year 600, and it's interesting because that one comes from Egypt. Now, there are, if we rewind for a minute, the evidence that we saw from family one, those 15 copies, is exaggerated by a lot of commentators, and they include Craig Evans and N.T. Wright. There's also some misinformation and claims about manuscripts with asterisks and obeli that needs to be addressed. Metzger said only described this very vaguely when he used a litote, when he said not a few manuscripts that contain this passage have scribal notes, or in other witnesses, the passage is marked with asterisk or obeli. So there's supposed to be unannotated manuscripts with asterisk and obeli, and this claim has spread far and wide from sources that you would usually think have at least looked at the manuscripts. But there are other errors too. That's just one error that needs to be corrected and withdrawn. Claims about this not showing up until 2 centuries after Mark began to circulate. That would be what? If Mark writes in 260, that would be the year 260. Ben Witherington probably using Metzger's uncorrected 1964 note, claim that Eusebius and Jerome says that all these verses were absent from all Greek copies known to them. And Ron Rhodes says these verses are absent from the Old Latin manuscripts. James Edwards likewise says the Old Latin version omits Mark 16. No. And also, in the 4th edition, Bruce Metzger and Bar Ehrman say that a number of manuscripts of the Ethiopic version do not contain Mark 16, 19, 20, but you can look in the same book and see where Metzger explained, and this claim of his goes back to 1980. In 1980, he retracted this claim, but somehow it is still circulating in his own book, the same book in which he explains, no, this is all due to a misunderstanding of what somebody wrote back in the 1800s, and that's why people say a number of manuscripts of the Ethiopic version, but they don't say which ones because there aren't any. All the copies of Mark that Metzger found and researched included Mark 16, 19, 20. Now, let's go into a little bit more detail as we wrap up and talk about some claims from Dan Wallace. Regarding the claims about asteroid and albalite, in 2008, Dan Wallace offered 5 or 6 manuscripts as examples to support this claim. 138, 264, 1221, 2346, 2812, and 137. Now, the online images of 137 and 138 are copyrighted at the Vatican Library's website, but you can find them at this address. And they're cataloged as manuscripts 756 and 757 at the Vatican Library. And they both feature the Catena Markham. So these are not unannotated manuscripts, they are Catena manuscripts. 137 has a red cross symbol before Mark 69, linked to another red cross symbol with the comment 3 pages later. 138 has an asterisk alongside of Mark 69, but on the same page in the lower margin, there's an extract from the Catena Markham that affirms the genuineness of verses 9 through 20 from Victor of Antioch, and even mentions his cherished Palestinian exemplar. In manuscript 2346, there is no asterisk at Mark 69 through 20. There is simply a cluster of 4 dots. But this is not a symbol that conveys doubt, and it appears in other places in the manuscript, just like the symbols for the beginning and the ends of lections. In 264, there's an asterisk alongside Mark 69, but the same symbol occurs in the margin in some other places at the beginning of ancient chapters. These were not intended to convey doubt, they signify the beginnings of the old chapters, the Kephalia. In manuscript 1221, you see again this 4-dot cluster before Mark 69. But the same symbol occurs in many other places throughout the manuscript at the beginning of chapters. In 221, it's at the top of the page, you can see the rubric for the 3rd Hierotheon, along with its incipit, the opening phrase that the lector would use. The 3rd reading for the resurrection. At that time, Jesus rose from the dead. And you can see the little cluster of dots. But the same cluster of dots appears in 221 before Mark 2:13, at the beginning of Kephalia chapter number 6, halfway through Mark 5:24, halfway through Mark 6:7, Luke 1:24, before Luke 1:26, before Luke 1:57, and you can read yourself. The dot clusters in 1221 have nothing to do with conveying doubt and have everything to do with signifying the beginning of Kephalia. What about the last manuscript, number 2812? That's the Zileda Gospels, which was lost for a while, but it eventually turned up in Madrid. It is a Catena manuscript, so again, it's got lots of notes with it. And there is no asterisk at Mark 69. There is a symbol that looks like a comet. I think it looks like an ice cream cone. But it does not denote doubt. It is just intended to draw the reader's attention to a note in the margin of a following page. And a couple of pages later, after Mark 69 is introduced, there we find the symbol again, accompanying a marginal note from the Catena Markham that claims these verses were found in a Palestinian exemplar that contained the true text of Mark. So the entire claim about asterisk and obeli is some sort of urban legend that really doesn't have a basis in reality. And there, I think we can move on to any questions that anyone might have. Peter?
I'll ask your questions, but I'll leave it to them first.
Thanks for your presentation, James. Would you mind talking again about why the correctors of Sinaiticus didn't add it in?
Peter, can you say it again?
He asked why you think the corrector of Sinaiticus did not include the longer ending.
Well, the corrector, because it wasn't in his copy, I think that the removal of Mark didn't happen in the days of the corrector of Codex Sinaiticus. That happened in a previous generation. But to that corrector, he wasn't trying to avoid Mark 16:9-20, but he was, in the copy that he used, it wasn't there. He was probably aware of what Eusebius had commented about it in Ad Marinum. Sinaiticus is probably made at Caesarea around the year 350 or so, and I suspect, I don't have videotape, but I suspect that it was made in the days of Eusebius and Acacius, who were two Arian bishops who were there as bishops. You can look it up. They're at Caesarea, and it says that Jerome mentions this in Lives of Famous Men, or Lives of Illustrious Men. Jerome mentions that these two people, that they had replaced some of the copies there that were wearing out because they were made of papyrus, and they replaced them with parchment copies. I think that Sinaiticus is one such copy made at Caesarea in about the middle of the 300s. I don't think that it's a copy that was made by Eusebius, simply because it has so many readings that Eusebius doesn't line up with in his quotations. For instance, at Matthew 27, 48, what we see in Vaticanus and Sinaiticus doesn't line up with the Eusebian canons. But I think that the copyist who made the cancel sheet was simply trying to not introduce anything that wasn't in his own exemplar, his master copy. I don't think he was trying to make a different text, but he simply had a view about verses 9-20. If you look closely at the copy, which you can see online at the codexsinaiticus.org website, you'll be able to notice the closing arabesque is very definitive if you compare the same scribe's work elsewhere in the manuscript. At this point in Mark, after the end of Mark 16:8, it's very, very definitive. He used two colors of ink, and this just made it so that this kind of almost offense after verse 8. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I had one. You mentioned Irenaeus. Was he referring to the shorter ending or the longer ending, and how do you know?
I think I can go back to get his slide up. Just a moment, and I'll go back to that note. Just give me a moment.
Because it seemed like it didn't seem like he was quoting Mark, at least what you put up. It was.
Oh no, he's most definitely quoting Mark.
Oh, okay.
Here you can see the note that we see in manuscript 1582, and also in manuscript 72, and also it's in at least one more manuscript, although we don't have the graphic here. But in Against Heresies, book 3, chapter 10, part 5, and this is the quotation from Irenaeus. Also, towards the conclusion of his gospel, Mark says, "So then, after the Lord Jesus had spoken to them, he was received up into heaven and sits on the right hand of God." Which, if you compare it to Mark 16, verse 19, well, just to make the comparison, see, it's right there. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, that's good, James, thank you.
Can you go back to your first slide, James, for us?
Say again?
Can you go back to your first slide?
Oh, yes.
I just want to make sure I have your own view correct. So you do not think that 16:9-20 is Mark's intended ending of his gospel, is that right?
I don't think that Mark was able to, Mark made a conscious, I don't think that Mark made a conscious decision to include verses 9 through 20, but somebody did so before Mark 16:9-20 was released for church use.
Right, so he didn't actually ever intend for verses 9-20 to be his ending, according to your view, is that right?
That is correct. I would add, though, that he didn't intend for verse 8 to be his ending either.
Right, so we don't have his intended ending then.
We do not have his intended ending.
Yeah, so another way to say it is you also think we've lost the original ending of Mark.
Well, no, I don't think I don't think that's a
No.
slippery way to put it. That's not the way I would put it. Mark
What?
simply never wrote what he wanted to write because he was interrupted. Rome in the mid-60s was a very violent place,
So you
and Mark probably had to.
oops, sorry. Do you think he was somehow stopped mid-sentence, or do you think that was a complete sentence, verse 8, or you don't know?
Well, if Mark 16:8 ended deliberately with Ephraim Hagar, that would be the first time ever that a narrative had ended in Gar. We see some compositions end in Gar occasionally, because rarely, but occasionally, because those are not narratives. It's somebody making a parenthetical comment at the end of what they say, like when they want to make a minor clarification. But in a narrative to end in Gar, the Gospel of Mark would be the very first one. So yes, I think Mark was interrupted as he was writing of Mark 16 verse 8, and didn't close out his thought and didn't write the rest of what he wanted to write. I think his colleagues recognized that that is not the way you end the story of Jesus. That is not the way you present what Peter had preached, because in Peter, we see in the book of Acts that Peter definitely mentioned the ascension and the resurrection of Jesus.
So just I guess I'm not sure why you know, or how you know that 9-20 is actually written by Mark, because as you say, if the people in Mark's church knew that's not how you ended the gospel, then surely that's also something that scribes knew too. So I guess I'm not sure how you decide that it's a simpler explanation to think that he wrote it and his church added it, rather than somebody else wrote it and then somebody else added it. Does that make sense? In other words, how do you isolate it to Mark wrote it and his colleagues added it, rather than Mark didn't write it and somebody else added it? Does that make sense?
Well, yes, I understand the question.
Okay.
If you look at Mark 16:9, the content, it doesn't look like something that was written to continue the narrative from verse 8. If you want to continue the narrative from verse 8, writing freely, and you had no model to go by, you would just do what Matthew did. You would make it line up with picking up the threads that were left.
Yeah.
You have Mary Magdalene left at the tomb, and when verses 9-20 pick up things up, you don't see her companions.
Right.
Where'd they go? They were on the stage a minute ago, and now they're gone. So you don't have this. The content of verse 9 and 10 is not consistent with the idea of somebody writing something to end the Gospel of Mark.
Right.
And do you see what I'm saying so far?
I do. I just don't see how you get from there to therefore Mark wrote it.
Well, I don't think that I don't have videotape, but there's no
Sure.
reason to not write something spontaneously unless you had something that you already respect as an authoritative writing.
Sure, but why Mark? You haven't gotten to Mark yet. That's what I'm asking.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
You still haven't explained why you think it's Mark. Granted that it doesn't fit with what comes before, and that it's not written precisely to be the fitting ending to what comes before. I grant all that. What I'm asking is, why do you think it was Mark that wrote it and not anybody else?
Well, Mark is basically in a school of one as far as people that had access to the remembrances of Peter.
Well, that presumes it's the remembrances of Peter and not just a pastiche from the other gospels. I mean, is there anything in here other than handling snakes and drinking poison that you can't get from the other gospel endings?
Except for all those things that are not found in the gospels, but you could say that about most of the gospel of Mark too.
Right. The difference is the rest of the gospel of Mark all fits together, whereas you're admitting that this part doesn't fit.
Well, yes, I would argue that this was not, that Mark 16:9-20 was not written as a conclusion for the gospel of Mark.
Right.
And the reason why you wouldn't make something up brand new using Matthew and Luke and John to fit in with those, the reason why you would do that, because you already had something. And what is the most likely place you would have it? It would be in the writings that Mark had already made, as he was working as Peter's assistant there in Rome for years.
So, but you don't think that's the case with the shorter ending, do you?
No.
So why one and not the other?
Well, in the shorter ending, you have, in Mark, just like we saw before, you have some words that are used only once, but in the shorter ending, it's almost as if the writer was trying not to read it like Mark, because it's very much removed from Mark's style.
Do you think 9-20 sounds like Mark's style?
Well, I think there's no reason why Mark had just one style, but whatever it wasn't like the shorter ending. The shorter ending very much looks, feels, sounds.
So we
And
know
in
enough
another
about Mark's style
sense,
to know it's not that, but we can't know if 9-20 is his.
Yeah.
Okay. We need any last questions?
Well, not knowing that, I would say not knowing one way or the other about that, I would say the testimony of the church, when you have all those church writers and you have all those manuscripts, that has to count for something.
Does it? We can disagree about that, I suppose. But okay. I mean, do you think a 10th century manuscript counts for something that happened in the 1st century in terms of who wrote it?
Say again?
Like, well, let me ask you this way: when you deal with Jerome's use of Eusebius, right, ad Mariam, you don't think that Jerome's testimony counts for very much, it seems to me, because he's basically just translating from Eusebius. Is that fair to say? Or did we lose you?
That is definitely fair to say. Yes,
Okay.
Eusebius is clearly recycling Eusebian material.
Yeah.
Even the questions that Marinus asks, Jerome, as he's writing to Hedibia, who's in the West somewhere,
Yeah.
he reuses Eusebius material, but he presents even the questions that Marinus asks, the same questions are reproduced in the same order.
Right. So, given the case that with Jerome's evidence, you think it's very important. Seems to be the case that you really want to weigh that rather than count Jerome and Eusebius as two witnesses. Wouldn't you want to apply that same principle then to your thousands of medieval manuscripts and say, granted that they're just copying from the manuscript in front of them, they would have no reason to leave out 9-20. The weight of their evidence is really not that much. Or no? Does that make sense? Or
well, getting from similar manuscripts need to be boiled down to not that much, is that there's a pretty big gap between those two things. Show me how they link together. But even if one would grant that point, like I said before, in Alexandrian copies like L, and in Western copies like Beze, and Byzantine copies like those thousands, I'm sorry, not thousands, hundreds, and also in Caesarean copies, you have Mark 16:19-20. It's simply there.
Sure,
That
but
implies it's in earlier copies.
But you could say the same
Now-
thing about Jerome, right? That his comments are there before him.
Say again?
Couldn't you say the same thing though about Jerome? Like it seems when you get to Jerome's evidence, you want to say it doesn't count for much because it's just a repetition. But then when you get to manuscripts, you don't want to apply the same principle.
Well, no. I would say certainly in any manuscript where you have a master copy of that copy, where you have its mother, certainly that should be boiled down. But do you have very many manuscripts where we can say this copy came from that copy, or do we have simply a case of let's try to diminish the visiting testimony because they're so similar?
Yes.
It seems like copies are sometimes dismissed simply because they agree.
Not
I don't
dismissed,
think
but just
that's a valid
reduced.
principle.
Well, not dismissed, but just reduced in the same way you do with Jerome and Eusebius. We're not dismissing either Jerome or Eusebius, but we are reducing them to one witness from two. Shouldn't we apply the same principle to the Byzantine manuscripts and say because they agree so much, we could reduce them down to, I don't know, a handful of witnesses or at least a group that all goes back to something earlier? Or no?
To an extent, for instance, when you have manuscripts that are accompanied by the same commentary, and it's clear that the commentary is using the same text, in those cases, that certainly should be boiled down. I think Morris Robinson, who believes the Byzantine text is the text that you should go to, I think even he grants that point. My point, though, is what we're doing with Jerome and Eusebius is not the same as the sort of reduction of weight that you're ascribing to this great amount of Byzantine manuscripts. Show me the mother-daughter relation cases, but those are exceptional cases. Simply because manuscripts agree doesn't mean that the testimony should be considered to be of lesser weight.
Then couldn't you apply the same principle then to Jerome and Eusebius, given that you know that you don't actually have Jerome's original manuscript that he copied from Eusebius's actual copy? Like, why does it have to be an absolute direct one manuscript to the next manuscript rather than just shared text to show the genealogical similarity? Does that make sense?
Well,
Seems to me that you're asking more.
I think that
about
anybody who
manuscript.
considers what Eusebius wrote
Yeah,
and considers tough.
but then the same principle applies to the Byzantine manuscripts. That's what I'm saying. Granted that.
Well, let me finish what we're saying.
What's that?
Applying the same principle. I'm sorry, can you phrase the question again?
No, that's okay. I think we actually probably, we should probably wrap it up here, James. We could probably go
Can
back.
you ask the question again so I can respond?
No, because I already asked it a couple times, so I think we probably should go because we need to carry on the lecture here.
I would just say that if anybody looks at Eusebius's comments, okay, but consider what D.C. Parker said. I think Parker is much more right than he is wrong.
Right, I agree. Okay, James, thank you so much for giving us extra time. So I know we kept you with the Q&A. I think we got a little bit of a lag here, so we're probably not catching each other completely, but thank you so much for all that wealth of information and taking time out of your busy schedule and your night to be with us.